Imagine the sound of concrete cracking under pressure it was never designed to bear. Picture a fortress built on swampland where 2,000 millimeters of rain fall every year, where the humidity makes steel doors swell shut and radio signals disappear into dead air. This is Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 in Tabasco, Mexico, a maximum security prison that cost 127,000 pesos per cell to build, but would ultimately cost far more in blood and broken careers. On March 15, 2019, what began as a routine prisoner transfer became 6 hours of gunfire, institutional collapse, and a cascade of failures that would expose how corner-cutting and climate created the perfect storm for disaster. Built in 28 months on land that floods, with locks that jam when it rains and communication systems cobbled together from incompatible equipment, this prison was designed to fail from the moment they poured the first concrete. The official reports called it an isolated incident. The truth is far more disturbing. Today, we're opening the complete forensic files on the Tabasco prison crisis, a story of political deadlines, procurement fraud, and the deadly arithmetic of building security on the cheap. We'll follow the money from the governor's ribbon-cutting ceremony to the moment guards were firing warning shots in flooded corridors, unable to communicate with each other while inmates barricaded themselves behind furniture. This is the untold story of institutional failure written in concrete and steel, where every cost-saving measure became a line item in a ledger of human suffering. If you're ready to examine how bureaucratic negligence becomes human tragedy, then settle in. This investigation goes deep. The morning mist clings to the outskirts of Villahermosa like a guilty secret. Here, where the city's ambitions meet the unforgiving reality of Tabasco's swamplands, a fortress of concrete and steel rises from ground that was never meant to hold such weight. The year is 2018, and the Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 is about to open its doors for the first time. But this story begins 2 years earlier, in a governor's office where campaign promises were being translated into blueprints, and where the arithmetic of public safety was about to collide with the physics of flood-prone terrain. The land cost 847 pesos per square meter. In American dollars, adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $4.30 per square foot. It was a bargain that would prove expensive in ways no accountant could calculate. The property sat 18 meters above sea level, which sounds reasonable until you consider that Villahermosa receives over 2,000 millimeters of rainfall annually. That's nearly 7 feet of water falling from the sky each year, seeking the path of least resistance through soil that drinks slowly and drains even slower. The engineers knew this. Their reports, filed in triplicate and stamped with the seal of the State Infrastructure Commission, contained warnings written in the careful language of professionals who understand liability. Subsection 4. 7 of the Geological Survey noted seasonal water table fluctuations of up to 2 meters and recommended enhanced drainage infrastructure with redundant pumping capacity. The estimated cost for this enhanced drainage was 3.2 million pesos. It was the first line item to be reduced when budget pressures mounted. Governor Patricia Mercado had made prison reform a centerpiece of her administration. Standing before television cameras in March of 2016, she announced that Tabasco would lead Mexico in creating facilities that rehabilitate rather than merely contain. The new prison would house 400 inmates in conditions that met international standards for human dignity. Construction would begin within 6 months, and the facility would open before her term ended. It was an ambitious timeline that compressed what should have been a 3-year process into 28 months. But political calendars wait for no one, especially not for concrete to properly cure or for drainage systems to be tested through a full rainy season. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on October 15, 2016, under skies that threatened rain but held their peace for the cameras. The governor drove a golden shovel into earth that was still soft from the previous night's downpour. Local contractors had been selected through a bidding process that favored speed over experience. The winning consortium, Constructora Tabasco Unida, had built shopping centers and housing developments, but had never constructed a maximum security facility. Their bid was 23% below the nearest competitor, a margin that should have raised questions but instead raised applause from budget-conscious officials. The cost per cell, as calculated by the State Planning Office, came to 127 pesos. Convert that to dollars, adjust for purchasing power, and you arrive at a figure roughly half what similar facilities cost in Texas or California. It was efficiency that would have impressed economists and worried engineers, had anyone thought to ask the engineers. Construction began with the ceremonial optimism that attends all public works projects. The first concrete was poured on November 3, 2016, during a break in the weather that lasted exactly 4 days. When the rains returned, they brought with them the first lesson in what it means to build on Tabasco's unforgiving ground. The construction schedule called for continuous pours of concrete for the foundation walls. Each section required 18 hours to reach initial set strength, during which time it could not be exposed to running water. But the Tabasco sky recognizes no human schedule, and the rains that November were particularly persistent. Tarps became the most important tools on the construction site, stretched over wet concrete like tents protecting a fragile camp. Miguel Santos, the site foreman, would later testify that they lost 6 working days that first month to weather delays. But the contract contained penalties for late delivery that amounted to 50 pesos per day beyond the agreed completion date. Faced with mounting losses, Constructora Tabasco Unida made the kind of decision that reverberates through concrete and steel for decades. They began pouring during weather windows that were shorter than optimal, and they began adjusting their concrete mixture to cure faster in high humidity. The adjustments were subtle. Instead of the specified 4 pounds per square inch compression strength, they aimed for 500. The difference might seem negligible, but concrete has a long memory. Over years of seasonal expansion and contraction, of tropical storms and dry seasons, those 500 pounds per square inch would matter in ways that accountants don't measure but structures feel. The prison's design called for walls of varying thickness depending on their security function. The outer perimeter walls were to be 40 centimeters thick, reinforced with steel rebar on 18-centimeter centers. The housing unit walls were specified at 25 centimeters, while the administrative sections required only 15. But as costs mounted and schedules compressed, these specifications became suggestions rather than requirements. The housing units, where inmates would spend most of their time, saw the most aggressive value engineering. Walls that should have been 25 centimeters thick were poured at 22. The difference of 3 centimeters saved approximately 240 cubic meters of concrete across the entire facility. At 800 pesos per cubic meter, this represented a savings of 432 pesos. It was a reduction that would never show up in any performance metric or safety inspection, but would quietly compromise the prison's structural integrity for as long as it stood. The rebar posed its own challenges. The specified steel was grade 60, designed to withstand 60 pounds per square inch of tensile stress. But grade 60 steel carried a premium price, and delivery schedules were uncertain. Constructora Tabasco Unida obtained approval to substitute grade 40 steel in non-critical applications. The definition of non-critical proved elastic under budget pressure. By the time construction was complete, roughly 30% of the prison's reinforcement consisted of the cheaper, weaker steel. The procurement process revealed other economies. The locking mechanisms for the cell doors came from 3 different suppliers, chosen not for compatibility, but for competitive pricing. Cerraduras del Sureste provided locks for the maximum security wing at 400 pesos each. Seguridad Industrial Mexicana supplied the medium security locks at 800 pesos each. The minimum security units received locks from a local fabricator, Herreria Villalobos, at 200 pesos each. The diversity of suppliers created what engineers call a single point of failure system, where the weakest component determines the strength of the whole. But it also created something more immediately problematic, a maintenance nightmare where different locks required different keys, different lubricants, and different replacement parts. The humid climate of Tabasco would test every mechanical system in ways that dry climates never do. The radio system suffered from similar procurement logic, rather than specify a single integrated communications network. The contract was split among multiple suppliers to encourage competitive pricing. Guard towers received Motorola equipment. Interior checkpoints got Kenwood radios. The control room used ICOM base stations. Each system operated on slightly different frequencies and used incompatible charging systems. During the planning phase, this diversity seemed like resilience. If one system failed, others would continue functioning. But radio systems, like locks and like concrete, perform best when they work as a unified whole. The electromagnetic interference between incompatible systems would create dead zones throughout the facility, areas where communications simply disappeared into the humid air. The first major test of the prison systems came before it held a single inmate. On August 14, 2017, tropical storm. Franklin brushed past Tabasco with winds that reached 85 kilometers per hour and rainfall that totaled 340 millimeters in 18 hours. The storm provided an unscheduled stress test for drainage systems that had never been fully completed. Water entered the facility through three primary routes: surface runoff from the surrounding hills, groundwater infiltration through the foundation, and direct rainfall on interior courtyards. The drainage system, already reduced from its original specifications, proved inadequate for all three challenges simultaneously. The main drainage canal, which should have been 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, had been constructed at 2, 5 meters wide and 1, 5 meters deep. The reduction saved 847 cubic meters of excavation at 340 pesos per cubic meter, a savings of 288, the usos 0 pesos. But drainage capacity is not linear. The smaller canal could handle only 60% of the water volume that the original design would have managed. Water backed up in the exercise yards, seeped through foundation walls, and pooled in the lower-level corridors. The electrical systems, installed to minimum code requirements, began showing signs of stress as humidity levels spiked. Most concerning of all, the locks began to stick. The cheaper metals used in the Herreria Villalobos locks swelled in the moisture, requiring increasing force to operate. Guards began carrying graphite sticks to lubricate stubborn locks, a temporary solution that would become a permanent necessity. The inspection reports from this period make for revealing reading. State inspectors working from checklists that focused on completed systems rather than their performance under stress signed off on construction phases that met the letter of their requirements. The locks turned even if they required extra effort. The radios transmitted even if the range was reduced. The concrete walls stood upright even if water stains already marked their surfaces. But there's a difference between systems that work and systems that work well, just as there's a difference between a prison that contains inmates and a prison that maintains control. These distinctions would become clear only under the stress of actual operations, when theoretical security would meet the reality of 400 human beings living in a space designed by committee and built by the lowest bidder. The formal opening of Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 took place on September 12, 2017, under blue skies that seemed to mock the concerns of weather-worried engineers. Governor Mercado arrived in a convoy of black SUVs, followed by federal officials, local dignitaries, and a carefully selected group of journalists. The tour route had been planned to showcase the facility's most impressive features: the modern medical wing, the computer-equipped classrooms, the administrative offices with their gleaming tile floors. What the visitors didn't see were the water stains in the lower-level corridors, already visible after just one major storm. They didn't test the radio dead zones or experience the effort required to turn some of the locks after a humid night. They didn't count the number of backup systems that had been reduced or eliminated to meet budget targets. Instead, they saw a facility that looked like progress, that felt like reform, and that photographed well for government websites and campaign materials. The governor's speech, delivered in the main assembly hall, emphasized the prison's role in breaking cycles of crime through rehabilitation and education. She spoke of vocational training programs and family visitation facilities, of medical care that met international standards and housing that preserved human dignity. The applause echoed off concrete walls that were already learning to hold water as well as sound. Behind the speeches and ribbon cutting, a different kind of preparation was taking place. The first inmates would arrive within 2 weeks, transferred from overcrowded facilities throughout the state. The initial population would be 340 prisoners, less than 25% of the prison's designed capacity. This phased opening was presented as a deliberate choice, allowing staff to adjust procedures and systems gradually as the population grew. In reality, the slow opening reflected a shortage of trained personnel. The guard force had been recruited quickly, with hiring standards relaxed to meet staffing deadlines. Many of the guards had no prior experience in corrections, having been drawn from municipal police forces, private security companies, and the ranks of the unemployed. Their training consisted of a 3-week program that covered basic procedures, emergency protocols, and the operation of security equipment. But 3 weeks cannot teach the subtle skills that separate effective corrections officers from uniformed guards. The ability to read tension in a housing unit, to recognize the signs of brewing conflict, to maintain authority without provoking confrontation. These skills develop over years of experience, not weeks of instruction. The new guards would learn these lessons on the job, with 340 inmates serving as their inadvertent instructors. The first night count took place at 9:00 p.m. on September 26, 2017. It should have been routine. Guards moving through each housing unit, accounting for every inmate, and reporting their numbers to the control room. But the count revealed problems that the ribbon-cutting ceremony had concealed. In Housing Unit C, the radio signal was too weak to reach the control room. Guard Rodriguez had to walk to the unit's entrance to make his report, adding 12 minutes to what should have been a 5-minute procedure. In Housing Unit A, 3 of the cell locks required significant force to secure, leading to delays as guards struggled with mechanisms that should have turned smoothly. The control room lost radio contact with the perimeter tower twice during the count, forcing guards to rely on cell phone communications. These weren't catastrophic failures, just the kind of small problems that accumulate like sediment in a system. But prisons operate on precision timing and reliable communications. When systems are stressed, small problems become larger ones, and larger problems can become dangerous very quickly. The first count was completed at 9:47 p.m., 17 minutes behind schedule. The official report noted minor equipment adjustments and recorded the count as successful, but 17 minutes represented more than a simple delay. It revealed gaps in training, equipment, and design that would only widen under the stress of increased population and operational tempo. Over the following weeks, as the inmate population grew from 340 to 580 to 820, these gaps began to matter more. Radio dead zones that seemed manageable with a skeleton crew became communication blackouts when every guard was needed simultaneously. Locks that stuck occasionally became daily frustrations that slowed every security procedure. Drainage problems that caused minor flooding during light rains became major disruptions when the autumn storms arrived. The prison was learning to function, but it was also learning its own limitations. Every daily count, every cell search, every inmate transfer taught the same lesson. Systems designed for efficiency work well until they don't, and when they fail in ways that threaten the careful balance between security and control that keeps a prison from becoming something else entirely. By December 2017, Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 housed 180 inmates, approaching its designed capacity of 140. The staff had grown from an initial crew of 85 to a full complement of 140 guards, administrative personnel, and support workers. On paper, the facility was performing within normal parameters, but the paper metrics captured only part of the story. The real story lived in the details that don't appear in official reports. The extra time required for every security procedure, the growing inventory of backup equipment needed to compensate for systems that worked only intermittently, and the fatigue that comes from operating a complex facility where nothing works quite as well as it should. The machinery of incarceration was running, but it was running rough. And somewhere in the humid corridors of a prison built too quickly on uncertain ground, the conditions were developing that would soon test every compromise, every cost-saving measure, and every assumption about how much stress a system can absorb before it breaks completely. The alarm sounds at 5:30 a.m. every morning at Centro de Reinserción Social número 2, cutting through the humid air with mechanical precision. By 6:00 a.m., the night shift guards are supposed to hand over their sectors to the incoming day crew, briefing them on any incidents, security concerns, or maintenance issues that arose during the 12-hour darkness. But handoffs, like every other procedure in the prison, had evolved to accommodate the realities that the original planners never anticipated. Guard Captain Elena Vasquez started her shift at 5:45 a.m. every Tuesday through Saturday, 15 minutes early to review overnight reports and prepare for the day ahead. But by January 2018, she was regularly arriving at 5:15 a.m., then 5:00 a.m., and eventually at 4:45 a.m. to deal with problems that accumulated like water in the inadequate drainage system. The extra time wasn't paid overtime. It was the unofficial tax that dedicated employees pay to make broken systems function. The night shift briefing took place in what was optimistically called the Communications Center, a room designed to accommodate 8 people but regularly packed with 12 or more. The original design included individual workstations with computer terminals and radio equipment for each guard supervisor, but budget cuts had reduced the number of terminals from 8 to 5, forcing supervisors to share equipment and wait their turn to access critical information. On February 7, 2018, Vasquez received a typical morning briefing from night shift supervisor Carlos Mendoza. 3 inmates in Unit B had been hospitalized during the night. 1 for chest pains that turned out to be anxiety, 1 for a slip in the shower that required stitches, and 1 for what appeared to be food poisoning, but was more likely the result of drinking contraband alcohol distilled from fruit salvaged from the kitchen. Unit C had experienced a power outage from 11:30 p.m. to 1:15 a.m., when humidity caused a breaker to trip repeatedly. The backup generator had functioned properly, but the outage had reset all the electronic locks, requiring guards to manually verify the security of 180 cells. Most concerning was the report from Unit D, where a verbal altercation between rival groups had required intervention at 2:30 a.m. The conflict hadn't escalated to violence, but intelligence suggested it was connected to disputes over cell assignments and access to the better jobs in the kitchen and laundry. The intelligence came from informal conversations rather than official reports, because the prison's formal intelligence gathering system existed mostly on paper. Mendoza's shift report concluded with a note that would become increasingly common. Staffing had fallen short of minimum requirements for 3 hours during the night when 2 guards called in sick, and a third failed to show up for his shift. The sick calls weren't suspicious, but they reflected a pattern that was becoming structural rather than occasional. Working in the humid environment of a facility where basic systems required constant attention was wearing down the guard force faster than anyone had anticipated. Absenteeism at Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 ran 15% higher than at comparable facilities in drier climates. The official explanation focused on the challenging nature of correctional work, but the real reason was simpler. The building itself was making people sick. Humidity levels that regularly exceeded 85% created ideal conditions for respiratory infections, skin conditions, and the kind of persistent fatigue that comes from working in an environment where your body never quite adjusts to the climate. The guard force had been calculated based on standard ratios of officers to inmates, but these ratios assumed equipment that worked reliably and systems that didn't require constant improvisation. When radio communications failed, guards had to walk messages between posts, doubling or tripling response times. When locks stuck, routine cell checks became extended operations that pulled officers away from other duties. When the drainage system backed up during storms, guards had to spend hours managing flooding rather than maintaining security. By March 2018, overtime had become the norm rather than the exception. Guards who were scheduled for 8-hour shifts regularly worked 10 or 12 hours to cover for absent colleagues and equipment failures. The overtime budget, originally calculated at 8% of base payroll, had ballooned to 23%. But prison schedules, unlike construction budgets, cannot simply be adjusted to accommodate cost overruns. The facility had to be staffed every hour of every day, regardless of budget constraints. The acoustic properties of Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 had never been properly tested, and the oversight became apparent as the facility approached full capacity. Concrete and steel create an environment where sound behaves unpredictably, and the prison's architects had apparently given no thought to how voices, alarms, and equipment noise would interact in the humid air. In Unit A, a conversation between two inmates in the lower tier could be clearly heard in cells on the upper tier, 30 meters away. But a guard's radio call from the unit's entrance might be inaudible to officers working in the center of the housing block. Sound seemed to bounce off the concrete walls in patterns that followed no logical rules, creating acoustic dead zones and unexpected amplification points throughout the facility. The problem was more than inconvenient. It was dangerous. Prison security depends on officers being able to communicate instantly and clearly, especially during emergencies. But in Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2, a guard's shout for backup might echo confusingly through multiple units, making it difficult to determine where help was needed. Radio static, already a problem due to the incompatible equipment systems, was amplified by the concrete acoustics until some communications became unintelligible. More subtly, the acoustic chaos affected the psychological environment of the prison. Inmates and guards alike lived in a constant state of auditory tension, never quite sure whether the sounds they heard indicated routine activity or developing problems. A dropped metal tray in the kitchen could sound like a fight. A maintenance worker's electric drill could be mistaken for an alarm. The constant uncertainty created stress that accumulated like humidity in the tropical air. Dr. Rafael Contreras, the prison's chief medical officer, began documenting what he termed environmental stress syndrome among both inmates and staff. Symptoms included elevated blood pressure, difficulty sleeping, increased anxiety, and a heightened startle response. By April 2018, requests for anti-anxiety medication had increased 340% over the levels projected during the planning phase. But the most significant acoustic problem was one that couldn't be measured in decibel levels. The way sound carried information throughout the facility in patterns that prison security systems aren't designed to handle. Inmates quickly learned to map the prison's acoustic properties, identifying areas where conversations could be overheard and locations where radio communications were weak. They developed hand signals and other nonverbal communication methods for use in areas where voices traveled too far. The intelligence network that developed among the inmate population was far more sophisticated than anything the official administration had created. Information about guard schedules, security procedures, and planned cell searches spread through the facility's informal communication channels faster than official orders moved through the guard force's compromised radio system. Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 operated on a transfer schedule that had been designed for efficiency but implemented without sufficient consideration for security implications. Every Tuesday and Friday, inmates arrived from other facilities throughout Tabasco and the neighboring states of Campeche and Chiapas. The transfers were necessary to manage overcrowding across the regional prison system, but they created predictable windows of vulnerability that quickly became known throughout the criminal networks that connected Mexico's correctional facilities. The transfer protocol called for incoming inmates to be processed through a reception area that included medical screening, property inventory, and classification interviews. The entire process was supposed to take no more than 4 hours per inmate, allowing transfers to be completed and new arrivals integrated into the general population before the evening count. But like every other system in the prison, the transfer process had to adapt to realities that the original planners hadn't anticipated. Medical screening, for example, required access to computerized records from other facilities, but the prison's internet connection was unreliable and slow. What should have been a 15-minute review of an inmate's medical history often stretched to 45 minutes or more as staff waited for data to download or attempted to contact other facilities by phone. The medical office, designed to process 8 inmates simultaneously, regularly held 12 or more as delays accumulated throughout the day. Property inventory created its own bottlenecks. Each inmate's personal belongings had to be cataloged, searched for contraband, and either stored or returned according to facility rules. But the property storage system had been designed for the prison's original capacity of 400 inmates, not the 680 who were housed there by May 2018. Storage lockers were packed beyond capacity, making it difficult to locate specific items when inmates were transferred out of the facility. The classification interviews, conducted by social workers and psychologists, were supposed to assess each inmate's security level, housing needs, and program eligibility. But the classification staff consisted of 3 people responsible for evaluating every new arrival. With transfers occurring twice weekly and involving anywhere from 12 to 35 inmates each time, the classification process became a perfunctory review rather than the thorough assessment that security protocols required. By June 2018, the average transfer day involved 18 hours of processing time spread across a 12-hour operational window. Guards worked mandatory overtime, medical staff postponed routine healthcare appointments, and the receiving housing units operated with reduced supervision as personnel were redirected to handle incoming prisoners. The transfers that were supposed to relieve pressure on the correctional system instead created pressure points that rippled throughout the facility's daily operations. But the most significant problem with the transfer schedule was its predictability. Criminal organizations, both inside and outside the prison system, quickly learned that Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 was most vulnerable every Tuesday and Friday between 8:00 a.m. and 6:00 p.m. During these windows, the facility operated with reduced staffing flexibility, compromised communications, and elevated stress levels among both inmates and guards. Intelligence reports from other facilities began noting increased activity around transfer days. Phone calls between facilities spiked, visits from family members clustered around transfer schedules, and disciplinary incidents in other prisons often occurred just before inmates were scheduled to be moved. The transfer calendar, designed to optimize transportation costs and administrative efficiency, had become a tactical document that criminal networks used to plan their own activities. The rainy season of 2018 arrived early and stayed late, testing every system in Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 with a persistence that felt personal. From May through October, the facility received 340 millimeters of rainfall, nearly 17% above the historical average. But averages don't capture the reality of tropical storms that drop 200 millimeters in 6 hours, or the way high humidity makes mechanical systems fail in sequence like dominoes falling in slow motion. On July 23, 2018, Tropical Storm Carlotta delivered 186 millimeters of rain to Villahermosa in 4 hours. The storm wasn't particularly severe by regional standards, but it provided a comprehensive stress test of every compromise and cost-saving measure that had been built into the prison's infrastructure. Water entered the facility through every possible route: overwhelmed gutters, inadequate drainage channels, leaking roof seals, and foundation walls that had never been properly waterproofed. The main electrical panel, located in what the architects had optimistically designated as a dry basement, found itself under 8 centimeters of standing water. Emergency protocols called for switching to backup generators, but the switch required manual intervention by maintenance staff who couldn't safely access the flooded electrical room. For 3 hours and 17 minutes, portions of Units B and C operated on emergency lighting while inmates remained locked in their cells, and guards relied on flashlights and cell phone cameras to conduct security checks. The lock failures began during the second hour of the storm. The cheaper metals used in 30% of the facility's locking mechanisms swelled in the extreme humidity, requiring increasingly forceful operation. By the time the storm passed, 17 cell doors could only be secured by applying graphite lubricant and using a technique that guards euphemistically called mechanical persuasion, striking the lock mechanism with a rubber mallet while turning the key. But the most dangerous failure was one that didn't become apparent until the following day. The radio system's base station, located in the control room on the second floor, had suffered water damage when humidity condensed inside the equipment housing. The damage wasn't immediately catastrophic, but it reduced transmission power and created intermittent dead zones throughout the facility. Radio communications that had been marginal became unreliable, and unreliable communications, in a prison environment, quickly become dangerous communications. Guard Sergeant Maria Lopez was conducting a routine inspection in Unit D when her radio failed completely during a developing incident between inmates. She pressed her emergency button, but the signal didn't reach the control room due to the storm-damaged equipment. Lopez had to choose between leaving her post to summon help or remaining to manage a situation that could escalate rapidly without backup. She chose to stay, successfully diffusing the incident through a combination of authority and improvisation that prison training programs don't teach. Lopez's success masked a larger failure. The storm had revealed that Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 couldn't maintain reliable communications during the weather events that occurred several times each year in Tabasco. The radio system that was supposed to provide instant contact between any guard and the control room had been compromised by humidity that the facility's climate control systems couldn't manage. The maintenance logs from July 2018 reveal the scope of the storm's impact. 37 work orders were filed in the week following Tropical Storm Carlotta, ranging from minor repairs like replacing water-damaged ceiling tiles to major concerns like repairing foundation cracks that had allowed water infiltration. The total cost of storm-related repairs reached 247,000 pesos, nearly double the facility's monthly maintenance budget. But the real cost wasn't measured in pesos spent on repairs. It was measured in the growing realization among staff and inmates alike that Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 was fighting a losing battle against the environment where it had been built. Every storm brought new failures. Every humid season accelerated the deterioration of systems that had been marginal from the beginning. The climate wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an active opponent that attacked the prison's infrastructure with the persistence of water seeking its level. And in a facility where security depended on mechanical systems, electrical equipment, and radio communications, environmental failures quickly became security vulnerabilities. The radio communication system at Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 had been designed by committee, procured by competitive bidding, and installed by the lowest bidder. By August 2018, it represented a case study in how well-intentioned cost savings can create operational failures that cost far more than the original savings. The system's fundamental problem wasn't technical but organizational. Instead of specifying a single integrated communications network, the procurement process had been divided among multiple contractors to encourage competitive pricing and prevent any single supplier from holding a monopoly. The result was a facility where guard towers used Motorola equipment operating on one frequency, housing units relied on Kenwood radios on a different frequency, and the control room coordinated everything through ICOM base stations that could monitor both systems but couldn't relay messages between them. This fragmentation might have been manageable in a smaller facility or a drier climate, but Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 pushed every component to its operational limits. The humidity that made locks stick also caused radio electronics to fail in ways that dry climate testing had never revealed. Contacts corroded, circuits shorted, and battery life decreased as the equipment struggled to function in an environment that exceeded its design specifications. Guard Captain Ramirez documented the communication failures in reports that read like technical manuals written by someone losing their sanity. On August 14, 2018, the radio system in Unit A failed completely for 47 minutes during the evening meal service. Guards had to communicate by runner, adding an average of 6 minutes to response times for routine requests, and making coordinated responses to emergencies effectively impossible. The runner system revealed its own vulnerabilities. Messages that should have taken 30 seconds to transmit by radio required 5 to 8 minutes when carried by foot through corridors that weren't designed for efficient movement. Guards had to navigate security checkpoints, locked doors, and crowded areas where inmates could observe and potentially interfere with communications. More problematically, the runners themselves became single points of failure. If a guard was injured or delayed while carrying a critical message, there was no backup system to ensure the communication reached its destination. The radio equipment that was supposed to provide instant, reliable contact between any 2 points in the facility had been replaced by a message system that belonged in a medieval castle rather than a modern correctional institution. The battery problem proved particularly expensive. Each radio system used different charging equipment, requiring the facility to maintain 3 separate inventories of chargers, batteries, and replacement parts. When batteries failed, and they failed frequently in the humid environment, guards often found themselves with dead radios and no compatible charging equipment available. By September 2018, the facility was spending 23 pesos per month on replacement batteries alone, nearly 5 times the amount budgeted for radio system maintenance. But the financial cost was secondary to the operational impact. Dead radios meant isolated guards, and isolated guards in a correctional environment represented security risks that compounded throughout the facility. The electromagnetic interference between incompatible radio systems created what communication specialists call a hostile RF environment, a situation where radio signals actually interfere with each other, creating dead zones and false signals that make reliable communication impossible. The 3 different radio systems, operating on frequencies that were technically compatible but practically problematic, generated interference patterns that shifted with weather conditions, humidity levels, and the number of radios in operation simultaneously. Dr. Luis Herrera, a communications engineer from the Universidad Juárez Autónoma de Tabasco, was brought in to assess the radio failures in October 2018. His report, filed with state authorities but never publicly released, concluded that the facility's communication system was fundamentally unreliable and unsuitable for critical security applications. He recommended a complete replacement of all radio equipment with a single integrated system designed for high-humidity environments. The estimated cost of Dr. Herrera's recommended upgrades was 8 million pesos. The estimate for continuing to maintain the existing system while replacing components as they failed was 4 million pesos over 3 years. But the most expensive option, continuing to operate with unreliable communications, couldn't be measured in pesos. It could only be measured in the risk that accumulates when guards can't talk to each other and supervisors can't coordinate responses to developing situations. By late 2018, Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 had evolved informal communication protocols that bypassed the official radio system entirely. Guards carried personal cell phones, used hand signals visible through security cameras, and developed abbreviated codes that could be transmitted quickly during the brief windows when radio communications functioned properly. The improvised system worked, after a fashion, but it worked the way a car with 3 functioning cylinders works. It moved forward, but no one could predict when it would stop running entirely. The intelligence reports that crossed the desk of Warden Alberto Salinas during November 2018 painted a picture of mounting tension that existed beneath the surface of routine daily operations. The reports, compiled by a security staff that had learned to work around the facility's communication and infrastructure problems, identified what they termed pressure indicators, behavioral patterns among inmates that suggested developing conflicts. Housing assignments had become a particular source of friction. The prison's original design included classification protocols that would separate rival gang members and place inmates in housing units based on their security levels and program needs. But overcrowding and mechanical failures had forced frequent housing changes that disrupted these carefully planned separations. When Unit B's plumbing failed in early November, requiring a 3-day shutdown for emergency repairs, 43 inmates had to be temporarily relocated to other housing units. The moves were supposed to be brief and random, but in a facility where every system required improvisation, temporary solutions had a way of becoming permanent. Some of the relocated inmates remained in their new housing assignments for weeks, creating tensions with existing residents and disrupting the informal social networks that inmates depend on for safety and stability. The yard rotation schedule, designed to give each housing unit equal access to outdoor recreation while maintaining security separation, had been compressed to accommodate staffing shortages and equipment failures. What should have been 2-hour recreation periods were reduced to 90 minutes, then 60 minutes, and then 45 minutes as guards struggled to manage movements between units without reliable radio communications. Shorter recreation periods meant more inmates spending more time in housing units that were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and acoustically hostile. Tempers shortened along with yard time, and minor disputes that might have been resolved through conversation or informal mediation began escalating into confrontations that required official intervention. The kitchen work assignments, traditionally one of the most sought-after jobs in any prison, became a source of particular tension at Centro de Reinserción Social número 2. The kitchen provided not only a break from the monotony of cell time, but also access to extra food and the kind of informal economy that develops in any closed community. But kitchen assignments had to be rotated frequently due to staff absences and security concerns, creating uncertainty and competition among inmates who depended on these jobs for both income and status. Intelligence specialist Carmen Torres noted in her November reports that conversations between inmates increasingly focused on transfer schedules and security procedures. Inmates were mapping guard rotations, identifying radio dead zones, and tracking the times when security coverage was thinnest. This kind of intelligence gathering was routine in any correctional facility, but the level of detail and organization that Torres observed suggested planning that went beyond simple curiosity about institutional operations. The most concerning intelligence came from phone monitoring and visitor observations. Conversations between inmates and outside contacts increasingly included coded references to specific dates and times. The codes weren't sophisticated, but they indicated coordination between inmates and criminal organizations outside the facility. References to the Tuesday problem and Friday opportunities clearly related to the transfer schedule that had become predictable enough to serve as a tactical planning tool. Torres's reports noted that visitor patterns had changed subtly but significantly. Family members were scheduling visits more frequently around transfer days, and some visitors were bringing items that required additional screening time. The items weren't contraband, but they suggested attempts to test security procedures and timing during the periods when the facility was most stressed. More troubling were the disciplinary reports from other facilities in the state system. Inmates scheduled for transfer to Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 were increasingly involved in incidents at their current facilities just before their transfer dates. The incidents weren't serious enough to prevent the transfers, but they suggested a pattern of behavior designed to create specific conditions or timing around the moves. By December 2018, the intelligence picture painted by Torres and her small staff showed a facility under pressure from both internal tensions and external coordination. The pressure wasn't dramatic or immediately dangerous, but it was building with the steady persistence of water seeking a weak point in concrete. And in a prison where basic systems required constant improvisation, weak points weren't difficult to find. Warden Salinas reviewed Torres's reports with the growing understanding that Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 was approaching what systems analysts call a convergence point, a moment when multiple stresses combine to overwhelm a system's ability to maintain normal operations. The facility was still functioning, still maintaining custody of its inmates, and still meeting the basic requirements of its mission. But it was doing so with decreasing margins for error and increasing dependence on the kind of improvisation that works right up until the moment it doesn't work at all. The stored energy of 18 months of accumulated stresses was building pressure in ways that couldn't be measured by standard correctional metrics. Population counts, incident reports, and budget analyses all suggested a facility operating within normal parameters. But normal parameters didn't capture the reality of guards working longer hours with less reliable equipment, inmates living in conditions that created constant low-level tension, and systems that functioned only through the daily heroics of staff members who had learned to work around rather than with their facility's infrastructure. The morning of March 15, 2019, began with the same routine that had governed Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 for 18 months of increasingly stressed operations. But routines, like concrete and steel, can only absorb so much pressure before they fracture in ways that transform the ordinary into the catastrophic. The weather report called for scattered thunderstorms with temperatures reaching 34 degrees Celsius and humidity climbing above 90%. For a facility where mechanical systems had learned to fail in sequence during high humidity periods, it was the kind of forecast that should have triggered heightened alert protocols. But alert protocols, like so many other systems at the prison, existed more completely on paper than in practice. Guard Captain Elena Vasquez arrived for her shift at 4:30 a.m., 45 minutes early even by her own standards of compensating for institutional dysfunction. The overnight reports painted a familiar picture of small failures cascading through interconnected systems. Unit C had experienced another power fluctuation that reset the electronic locks, requiring manual verification of 180 cell doors. The radio system in Unit D had suffered intermittent failures between midnight and 3:00 a.m., forcing guards to rely on runners for non-emergency communications. 3 inmates in Unit A had been treated for respiratory distress related to humidity levels that exceeded the facility's ventilation system's capacity to manage. But buried in the routine catalog of mechanical disappointments was an intelligence note that should have changed the morning's priorities. Inmate phone monitoring had detected unusual activity the previous evening, with multiple references to Friday's delivery schedule and the package that's been delayed. Intelligence specialist Carmen Torres had flagged the communications as potentially significant, but her report reached Vasquez's desk at 6:15 a.m., 90 minutes after the decision-making window for adjusting security protocols had closed. The Friday transfer schedule called for the arrival of 23 inmates from facilities in Campeche and Chiapas, slightly above the average but well within the facility's theoretical processing capacity. The convoy was scheduled to arrive at 9:00 a.m., with processing expected to conclude by 2:00 p.m. But theoretical capacity, like so many planning assumptions at Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2, had never successfully navigated the reality of systems that required constant improvisation. The first sign of trouble emerged at 8:45 a.m. when the lead vehicle in the transfer convoy reported mechanical problems 15 kilometers from the facility. The convoy's 3-vehicle formation, designed to maintain security during transport, couldn't safely continue with one disabled truck. Standard protocol called for the convoy to halt while replacement transportation was arranged, but the breakdown occurred on a highway section with limited secure stopping areas. Convoy Commander Lieutenant Rafael Morales made the decision to continue to the prison with 2 vehicles carrying 23 inmates who should have been distributed among 3 trucks. The redistribution meant that each remaining vehicle carried 12 inmates instead of the planned 8, increasing security risks and reducing the guards' ability to manage problems during transport. But stopping on an exposed highway with a disabled vehicle seemed to present even greater risks than proceeding with the compromised formation. The decision to continue revealed the kind of impossible choice that had become routine at Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2. Every option carried risks that the facility's systems weren't designed to handle, and every decision required choosing between competing safety priorities without adequate information or resources. The convoy proceeded toward a prison that was already operating beyond its design specifications, carrying inmates in a configuration that exceeded security protocols during weather conditions that historically caused mechanical failures throughout the facility. The convoy arrived at 9:17 a.m. under skies that were building toward the afternoon storms that the Weather Service had predicted. The delay was minor by the standards of a transportation system that regularly dealt with vehicle breakdowns, road conditions, and scheduling conflicts. But even minor delays in an overstressed system can trigger cascade failures that transform routine operations into emergency situations. The gate mechanism that controlled access to the prison's secure perimeter had been installed by the same contractor who supplied the problematic locks throughout the facility. Like those locks, the gate hardware included cheaper metals that swelled in high humidity and required increasing force to operate properly. On most days, the gate opened slowly but reliably. But March 15th was not most days. The gate's electric motor, struggling against humidity-swollen components, began cycling on and off as it attempted to retract the heavy steel barrier. The cycling created electrical surges that interfered with the radio equipment in the guard tower, adding static to communications that were already compromised by the storm-damaged base station. Gate Guard Corporal Jesus Nunez attempted to operate the mechanism manually, but the backup system required a key that was locked in a supervisor's office. For 12 minutes, the transfer convoy sat outside a gate that refused to open completely, while guards inside the facility attempted to coordinate a response using radio equipment that was generating more noise than information. The 12 minutes felt longer in the humid confines of transport vehicles where inmates and guards alike understood that extended delays represented opportunities for problems that no one wanted to contemplate. The gate finally opened at 9:29 a.m. after maintenance worker Diego Paz arrived with lubricant and the mechanical expertise that came from 18 months of improvising solutions to problems that shouldn't have existed. But the delay had compressed the transfer schedule in ways that would affect every subsequent operation throughout the day. The receiving area, designed to process 8 inmates simultaneously, was suddenly faced with 12 inmates from the first transport vehicle, while preparations for the second vehicle's 11 inmates had to be accelerated to prevent further delays. Medical screening, property inventory, and classification interviews were compressed from the already rushed standard timeline to an emergency pace that prioritized speed over thoroughness. Dr. Patricia Ramos, the facility's medical officer, later testified that she was asked to complete medical screenings in half the normal time while dealing with paperwork delays caused by internet connectivity problems that had persisted since the previous month's storm damage. 2 inmates required prescription medications that weren't immediately available from the facility pharmacy, necessitating calls to outside medical providers and additional delays that rippled through the entire processing sequence. But the most significant problem wasn't logistical but human. The compressed timeline and mechanical failures had created stress levels that affected decision-making throughout the facility. Guards who were already working extended hours to compensate for chronic understaffing found themselves managing emergency procedures while dealing with equipment that functioned unpredictably. Supervisors who normally had time to coordinate between departments were making rapid decisions based on incomplete information transmitted through compromised radio systems. The convergence of mechanical failures, weather stress, and operational pressure had created exactly the kind of situation that security experts warn about. A moment when multiple small problems combined to overwhelm a system's ability to maintain control. But warning about convergence points and recognizing them in real time are entirely different challenges, especially in an environment where small problems were so routine that they no longer triggered heightened awareness. The radio failure occurred at 11:43 a.m., 93 minutes into a transfer process that should have been routine but had become a carefully orchestrated dance around mechanical dysfunction. Guard Sergeant Luis Mendoza was attempting to coordinate between the processing area and Unit B when his radio simply stopped transmitting mid-sentence. The failure wasn't dramatic, no sparks or smoke, just the sudden absence of response from equipment that had been marginal but functional moments before. Mendoza's first assumption was battery failure, a common occurrence that guards had learned to manage through constant vigilance about charging schedules and backup equipment. But replacing the battery didn't restore communications, and testing other radios revealed that the problem wasn't isolated to a single unit. The humidity-damaged base station had finally suffered a complete failure that eliminated radio coverage throughout a quarter of the facility. The dead zone included portions of Units B and C, the main corridor connecting the housing units to the processing area, and one of the 2 guard towers that provided oversight of the exercise yards. In a facility where radio communications had never been completely reliable, the loss of coverage in these critical areas represented a catastrophic degradation of security capabilities. Standard emergency protocols called for immediate notification of supervisory personnel and the implementation of backup communication procedures. But the backup procedures assumed that some radio communications would remain functional, allowing coordination of the enhanced security measures needed when primary systems failed. The scope of the current failure exceeded the assumptions on which emergency protocols had been based. Guard Captain Vasquez was in the administrative building when she received word of the radio failure by runner, the same communication method that medieval armies used to coordinate across battlefields. The irony of managing a modern correctional facility through messages carried on foot wasn't lost on her. But irony couldn't solve the immediate security implications of losing communications during an already stressed transfer operation. The decision tree that faced Vasquez included no attractive options. She could halt the transfer process, leaving inmates in temporary holding areas while radio repairs were attempted, but the holding areas weren't designed for extended occupation, and the compressed schedule had already created crowding problems. She could continue the transfer using runner communications, accepting the increased response times and coordination difficulties that would result. Or she could attempt to expedite the remaining transfers to minimize the time that the facility operated with degraded communications. Each option carried risks that the facility's systems weren't designed to handle. Halting the transfer created security risks associated with prolonged crowding in temporary facilities. Continuing with runner communications created response time delays that could prove critical if incidents developed. Expediting the process created the risk of procedural shortcuts that might compromise safety or miss contraband that standard screening would detect. Vasquez chose to continue the transfer process while dispatching maintenance personnel to attempt radio repairs and implementing enhanced manual security measures in the affected areas. It was a decision that tried to manage multiple competing risks simultaneously, but risk management in an overstressed system often becomes a process of choosing which dangers to accept rather than eliminating dangers entirely. The manual security measures required reassigning guards from other duties to provide the oversight and coordination that the radio system normally enabled. Guards who should have been conducting routine security rounds were stationed as human communication links between areas that could no longer talk to each other electronically. The reassignments reduced security coverage throughout the facility while increasing the number of personnel involved in managing what should have been a routine transfer operation. The increased staffing demands came at a time when the facility was already operating with reduced personnel due to the chronic absenteeism that humid working conditions had made routine. 3 guards had called in sick that morning, and 2 others had failed to report for their shifts without calling in. The absent guards represented a 12% reduction in available personnel during a day when operations required enhanced staffing levels. By 12:30 p.m., Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 was operating at 73% of minimum staffing levels while managing a transfer process that required 115% of standard staffing, using communication systems that functioned at approximately 60% of design capacity, in weather conditions that were stressing every mechanical system in the facility. The mathematics of institutional failure don't require complex calculations. When demand exceeds capacity by margins that compound across multiple systems simultaneously, breakdown becomes inevitable rather than merely possible. The breakdown, when it came, started with something as simple as a door that wouldn't close properly. Transfer Vehicle 2 had been unloaded successfully despite the radio problems and staffing challenges that had defined the morning's operations. 11 inmates had completed medical screening and were being moved to temporary housing in Unit D, while their classification interviews were completed. The move required escorting the group through corridors where radio communications were dead, using hand signals and predetermined routes to coordinate between guards who couldn't talk to each other. The temporary housing area in Unit D consisted of holding cells that were designed for short-term use during processing and disciplinary procedures. The cells were smaller than standard housing and lacked some of the amenities that inmates expected in permanent assignments, but they were supposed to be occupied for only a few hours, while paperwork and classification procedures were completed. The door to holding cell 7 had been giving guards trouble for 3 weeks. requiring increasingly forceful operation as humidity caused the locking mechanism to swell and bind. Maintenance requests had been filed, but the repair had been deferred, while more critical failures received priority attention. On most days, the door could be secured with extra effort and liberal application of graphite lubricant. But March 15th was testing every marginal system in the facility. Guard Corporal Maria Santos applied the usual combination of force and lubricant to secure the door after placing 2 inmates in the holding cell. The door appeared to close properly, and the lock mechanism turned with only slightly more resistance than normal. But appearances, in a facility where mechanical systems required constant improvisation, could be deceiving. Unknown to Santos, the humidity-swollen components of the lock had created a mechanical configuration where the door appeared to be secured but wasn't actually locked. The bolt had engaged partially but not completely, creating a situation where casual inspection would suggest proper closure, while significant force could still open the door. The defective lock represented exactly the kind of single-point failure that systems engineers warn about, a component that fails in a way that isn't immediately obvious, but creates critical vulnerabilities. In a properly functioning facility with adequate communication systems and standard staffing levels, the defective lock would have been discovered quickly and corrected before it could create security problems. But Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 was operating well outside the parameters that define proper functioning. Santos continued her rounds through Unit D, checking the security of other temporary housing assignments and coordinating with guards in areas where radio communications were still functional. The radio dead zone meant that her status updates had to be carried by runner to supervisors who were managing multiple emergency procedures simultaneously. The communication delays that resulted meant that problems in Unit D might not be reported to supervisory personnel for 5 to 8 minutes after they occurred. At 1:17 p.m., inmate Carlos Rivera tested the door to holding cell 7 and discovered that it opened with pressure that wouldn't have been sufficient to operate a properly functioning lock. Rivera had been transferred from a facility in Campeche, where he had served 18 months of a 6-year sentence for armed robbery and assault. His institutional record included multiple disciplinary actions for attempting to manipulate security procedures and exploit weaknesses in facility operations. Rivera's discovery of the unsecured door created an immediate tactical decision that would determine whether a mechanical failure became a security incident. He could report the problem to guards, securing credit for cooperative behavior that might benefit him during future disciplinary hearings. He could ignore the discovery, avoiding involvement in potential complications, or he could exploit the opportunity in ways that his criminal experience had taught him to recognize and utilize. The decision was influenced by factors that prison administrators couldn't have anticipated when they planned the facility's security procedures. Rivera's cellmate, Jose Herrera, was a member of a criminal organization that had been feuding with rivals who were housed in Unit B. The feud had been managed through careful housing assignments and restricted movement privileges, but the compressed transfer schedule had created opportunities for contact that normal security procedures would have prevented. Herrera had learned through the informal intelligence network that connected inmates throughout the facility that several of his organization's rivals were scheduled to be moved through the main corridor that connected Unit D to the processing area. The movement would occur during the afternoon shift change when guard coverage was typically reduced, and the radio communications problems meant that guards couldn't coordinate as effectively as usual. The combination of the unsecured door, the scheduled movement of rival inmates, and the degraded communication capabilities created what tactical analysts call a convergence opportunity, a moment when multiple factors align to make actions possible that would normally be prevented by institutional security measures. Rivera and Herrera understood this convergence in ways that didn't require formal training in security analysis. At 1:23 p.m., Rivera quietly opened the door to holding cell 7 and stepped into a corridor that should have been secure but was being monitored by guards who couldn't communicate effectively with supervisory personnel. The escape wasn't dramatic or violent, just a criminal walking through a door that was supposed to be locked but wasn't, during a time when the people responsible for preventing such events were dealing with mechanical failures that had consumed their attention and resources. The escape wouldn't be discovered for another 17 minutes, by which time Rivera had moved through corridors that he had learned to navigate during his brief time in the facility. The informal intelligence network that inmates maintained had provided him with information about guard routines, camera coverage, and the radio dead zones that created gaps in institutional awareness. But Rivera's escape was only the beginning of a cascade of events that would transform a mechanical failure into the kind of crisis that destroys careers, changes policies, and provides cautionary lessons for future administrators who believe that security can be achieved through procedures rather than properly functioning systems. The first indication that something was wrong came at 1:34 p.m. when Guard Santos discovered that holding cell 7 was open and empty. Her immediate assumption was that Rivera had been moved by other guards as part of the transfer process, but checking with other personnel revealed that no movement orders had been issued. The realization that an inmate had escaped from what was supposed to be secure housing triggered emergency protocols that the facility had never actually tested under operational conditions. Santos attempted to radio the control room to report the escape, but her location in Unit D was within the communications dead zone that had resulted from the morning's equipment failure. Following emergency procedures, she began moving toward an area with functional radio coverage while sending a runner to notify supervisory personnel directly. But the runner had to navigate through areas where the radio failures had created enhanced security measures that slowed movement throughout the facility. The escape notification reached Guard Captain Vasquez at 1:41 p.m., 7 minutes after the discovery and 18 minutes after Rivera had actually left his cell. In an institution where seconds can determine whether security incidents are contained or escalate into larger crises, 18 minutes represented an eternity of opportunity for a determined criminal to cause problems that would be difficult to resolve. Emergency lockdown procedures called for securing all inmate movement throughout the facility while conducting systematic searches for the missing prisoner. But implementing lockdown procedures required coordinating between housing units using communication systems that were functioning at reduced capacity during a period when the facility was already managing multiple operational stresses. The lockdown order reached most housing units within 5 minutes of being issued, but Unit C didn't receive the notification for 12 minutes due to the communication failures that had plagued the facility all day. During those 12 minutes, routine inmate movement continued in portions of the facility that should have been secured, creating additional opportunities for problems that competent security procedures are designed to prevent. But the most significant complication wasn't procedural, but physical. Rivera hadn't simply disappeared into the facility's infrastructure. He had used his freedom to approach the area where rival gang members were being processed as part of the day's transfer operations. The movements that normal security procedures would have prevented were occurring during the exact time window when institutional defenses were compromised by equipment failures and communication breakdowns. The confrontation occurred at 1:47 p.m. in the main corridor that connected the housing units to the processing area. Rivera encountered 3 members of the rival organization that his group had been feuding with during a moment when guards were dealing with lockdown procedures and couldn't coordinate effectively due to radio failures. The meeting wasn't accidental. Rivera had used information from the inmate intelligence network to time and position the encounter for maximum impact. The violence that followed was brief but sufficient to transform an equipment failure into a crisis that would dominate news coverage, trigger legislative investigations, and destroy the careers of administrators who had spent 18 months learning to manage a facility that was designed to fail under pressure. The first gunshot was fired at 1:49 p.m. by Guard Lieutenant Miguel Torres, who was attempting to stop the confrontation between Rivera and the rival gang members. Torres later testified that he fired a warning shot into the air to disperse the fighting inmates, following procedures that had been designed for outdoor areas with clear sightlines and adequate space for safe warning fire. But the main corridor of Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 was neither outdoor nor spacious. The confined space and concrete walls created acoustic and ricochet conditions that transformed a warning shot into a projectile that bounced unpredictably through an area where other guards and inmates were present. The bullet, fired from a weapon that was loaded with live ammunition rather than the less lethal rounds that many facilities used for crowd control, struck a concrete wall and fragmented into pieces that injured 2 inmates and caused panic throughout the immediate area. The sound of gunfire in a confined space, filled with people who understood that gunfire in prison environments rarely remained limited to single shots, triggered immediate and widespread panic. Inmates who weren't involved in the original confrontation began seeking cover or attempting to leave the area, while guards who couldn't communicate effectively tried to coordinate responses to a situation that was developing faster than institutional procedures could manage. The second shot was fired 37 seconds later by Guard Corporal Diana Reyes, who was responding to reports of gunfire but couldn't clearly see the source of the problem due to smoke that had begun accumulating in the inadequately ventilated corridor. Reyes fired at what she believed was an armed inmate, but her target was actually another guard whose weapon was drawn but who couldn't be clearly identified in the chaos and poor visibility. The bullet missed its intended target but struck a water pipe that ran along the corridor ceiling, creating a pressurized spray that reduced visibility further while adding water damage to the list of problems that facility maintenance would have to address after the crisis concluded. The ruptured pipe also triggered automatic fire suppression systems that were designed to activate when water sensors detected leaks, adding alarm noise to an environment that was already acoustically chaotic. Within 90 seconds of the first warning shot, Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 had transformed from a facility experiencing equipment problems to an institution in crisis. Guards were firing weapons in confined spaces with poor visibility and compromised communications. Inmates were reacting to gunfire and confusion with the kind of survival instincts that don't distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate responses. And the facility's mechanical systems were responding to the crisis by adding alarms, water damage, and additional equipment failures to a situation that was already beyond the capacity of normal procedures to manage. The convergence of equipment failures, procedural breakdowns, and human reactions had created exactly the kind of cascade failure that systems engineers warn about but that administrators hope will never occur. Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 was discovering the difference between theoretical security and actual security, between systems that work on paper and systems that work under pressure. The cascade failure that began with a stuck door lock and escalated through gunfire would ultimately consume 6 hours, require intervention from 3 different law enforcement agencies, and transform Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 from a troubled correctional facility into a national symbol of institutional dysfunction. But in the immediate moments following the second gunshot, the crisis was still contained within the physical boundaries of the prison, even as it spiraled beyond the capacity of prison personnel to control. The automatic fire suppression system that activated when the water pipe ruptured had been installed according to minimum code requirements, which assumed that sprinkler activation would occur in response to actual fires rather than ricocheting bullets. The system dumped 340 liters per minute into a corridor that was already compromised by poor drainage, creating standing water that made footing treacherous, while electrical systems sparked and failed throughout the affected area. Guard Captain Elena Vasquez was coordinating multiple emergency responses from the control room when the fire alarms added their mechanical screaming to the acoustic chaos of gunfire, shouting, and running water. The control room's security cameras provided visual coverage of most areas within the facility, but the monitors showed only confusion and movement without the context that clear communications might have provided. Guards appeared to be moving purposefully, but without radio contact, Vasquez couldn't determine whether they were responding to orders, reacting to immediate threats, or simply trying to find safer positions in a facility where safety had become a relative concept. The camera monitoring Unit B revealed that inmates there were reacting to the sounds of gunfire and alarms by barricading their cells and demanding information that guards couldn't provide because they didn't have reliable information themselves. The institutional routine that normally governed inmate behavior had been replaced by the kind of survival psychology that emerges when people realize that the systems designed to protect them are no longer functioning predictably. In Unit C, inmates who could hear but not see the developing crisis were responding with the practical intelligence that comes from understanding how institutional failures cascade. They were securing personal property, identifying potential weapons, and positioning themselves for whatever might follow the sounds of violence and mechanical alarm. Their responses weren't panicked, but were the calculated preparations of people who had learned not to depend on institutions for their safety. But the most immediate problem facing Vasquez wasn't the inmate reaction, but the guard response. Personnel who couldn't communicate effectively were making individual decisions about when to use force, when to seek cover, and when to attempt to control situations that were developing faster than standard procedures could address. The radio silence that had begun as an equipment failure was now preventing the kind of coordination that might distinguish appropriate force from excessive force, legitimate targets from friendly fire. At 1:52 p.m., 3 minutes after the first warning shot, Vasquez made the decision that would define the remainder of the crisis and ultimately end her career in corrections. Unable to coordinate with guards in the affected areas, and watching security cameras that showed confusion without context, she activated the facility's highest-level emergency protocol, a call for immediate assistance from external law enforcement agencies. The emergency assistance request went simultaneously to the Tabasco State Police, the Mexican Army's 30th Infantry Battalion stationed near Villahermosa, and the Federal Prison System's Rapid Response Team based in Mexico City. Each agency had different response procedures, different equipment capabilities, and different rules of engagement for incidents involving correctional facilities. None had trained extensively with the others, and none had detailed knowledge of Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 beyond what was contained in theoretical briefing documents. The State Police Response Team was the first to arrive, reaching the prison's outer perimeter at 2:17 p.m. in 6 vehicles, carrying 23 officers equipped for riot control. But the same gate mechanism that had delayed the morning's inmate transfer continued to malfunction, requiring the response team to wait outside the facility while maintenance personnel attempted to operate hardware that had been marginal when installed and had deteriorated under 18 months of humid weather and deferred maintenance. The delay at the gate created the kind of tactical problem that tactical manuals discuss, but that real-world emergencies rarely accommodate. The response team could see and hear evidence of crisis within the facility, but they couldn't immediately access the areas where their intervention was needed. The psychological effect on both the responding officers and the prison personnel who were waiting for assistance was exactly what emergency response experts warn about. Help that is visible but unavailable often creates more stress than help that is simply absent. Lieutenant Colonel Roberto Mendez, commanding the state police response, later testified that his officers could hear gunfire and alarms from inside the prison while they waited for the gate to open. The sound suggested an ongoing crisis that required immediate intervention, but tactical doctrine emphasizes the importance of coordinated entry and clear communications with facility personnel before introducing additional armed personnel into confined spaces where identification of threats and friendlies becomes critical. The gate finally opened at 2:23 p.m., 6 minutes after the response team's arrival. But 6 minutes in a crisis situation represents multiple lifetimes of opportunity for problems to escalate, and Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2 had used those minutes to demonstrate how institutional failures compound when subjected to external pressure. While the state police waited outside, the situation inside had evolved from a localized incident involving escaped inmates and warning shots to a facility-wide emergency where normal procedures had been replaced by improvisation and individual judgment. Guards who couldn't communicate with supervisors were making decisions about the use of force based on incomplete information and immediate perceptions of threat. Inmates who couldn't get reliable information about the crisis were responding with the assumption that their safety depended on their own actions rather than institutional protection. The third gunshot was fired at 2:19 p.m. by Guard Sergeant Luis Martinez, who was attempting to prevent what he believed was an escape attempt by multiple inmates near the facility's rear exit. Martinez later testified that he observed 6 inmates moving rapidly toward an exit door during a period when all inmate movement should have been secured. and that his commands to halt were ignored in the acoustic chaos of alarms and running water. But the inmates Martinez observed weren't attempting to escape. They were kitchen workers who had been trying to reach their housing unit when the lockdown was announced, and who were following evacuation procedures they had learned during safety training. The evacuation procedures, designed for fire emergencies, called for rapid movement toward designated exits, but they hadn't been modified to account for security lockdowns where rapid movement might be interpreted as escape attempts. Martinez's shot struck the wall near the exit door, sending concrete fragments into the face of inmate Roberto Sanchez and creating injuries that would require immediate medical attention. But the facility's medical staff was already responding to injuries from the first shooting incident, and the compromised communication system meant that medical personnel couldn't coordinate effectively between multiple casualty locations. The injury to Sanchez represented more than a medical emergency. It demonstrated that the crisis had evolved beyond the capacity of institutional medical resources to manage. The prison's medical facility was designed to handle routine health care and minor emergencies, not multiple trauma cases occurring simultaneously during a period when normal coordination procedures weren't functioning. Dr. Patricia Ramos, attempting to treat multiple injured inmates with limited supplies and no reliable communication with outside medical facilities, made the decision to request emergency medical evacuation for the most seriously injured patients. The request required coordination with civilian emergency medical services, adding another external agency to a crisis that was already straining the facility's ability to manage multiple response efforts. But the most significant development wasn't medical, but tactical. The sound of 3 gunshots over a 30-minute period had convinced many inmates that the facility was experiencing the kind of systematic breakdown that occasionally occurs in correctional institutions when institutional control collapses entirely. Their response wasn't panic, but rather the kind of practical preparation that people make when they realize they might need to protect themselves without institutional assistance. Inmates throughout the facility began securing cell doors, gathering improvised weapons, and identifying defensible positions within their housing areas. These weren't aggressive actions, but defensive preparations based on the reasonable assumption that a crisis involving multiple gunshots might expand beyond its current scope. But defensive preparations by inmates during a crisis can quickly be misinterpreted as aggressive actions by guards who are already operating under stress with limited information. The 4th gunshot was fired at 2:31 p.m. by Guard Corporal Miguel Santos, who was conducting security sweeps in Unit A when he encountered inmates who had barricaded their common area using tables and benches from the recreation room. Santos interpreted the barricade as evidence of inmate uprising and fired a warning shot to demonstrate that guards retained control of the facility. But the barricade Santos encountered wasn't evidence of uprising. It was a defensive measure implemented by inmates who were trying to protect themselves during what they reasonably believed was a breakdown of institutional security. The inmates hadn't threatened guards or attempted to take control of facility operations. They had simply created physical barriers between themselves and corridors where gunfire had been occurring. Santos's warning shot, like the previous 3, was intended to demonstrate authority and restore order. But in the acoustic environment of concrete corridors with inadequate ventilation, each gunshot contributed to an atmosphere of crisis that made rational decision-making increasingly difficult for both guards and inmates. The cumulative effect of multiple warning shots was exactly the opposite of what warning shots are intended to achieve. Instead of restoring order, they were convincing everyone in the facility that order had already been lost. By 2:35 p.m., when the state police response team finally gained entry to Centro de Reinserción Social Número 2, they encountered a facility where the normal boundaries between guards and inmates, between routine operations and emergency procedures, between institutional control and institutional chaos, had become blurred beyond recognition. The state police officers entered a prison where gunfire echoed through corridors filled with water from broken pipes, where alarms created constant noise that prevented clear communication, where guards and inmates alike were making decisions based on survival instincts rather than established procedures. It was a facility that looked like a prison, but functioned like a combat zone, where standard police tactics and correctional procedures had been replaced by individual judgment and immediate reaction. Lieutenant Colonel Mendez established a command post in the administrative building and attempted to assess the scope of the crisis through communications with facility personnel. But the radio system failures that had contributed to the crisis also prevented effective coordination with the response teams that were supposed to resolve it. External responders found themselves operating with the same communication limitations that had contributed to the institutional breakdown they were trying to address. The initial assessment suggested a facility-wide uprising involving multiple housing units, escaped inmates, injured guards, and active shooting by all parties. The assessment was based on fragmented communications, security camera footage that showed movement and confusion without context, and reports from guards who were operating under extreme stress with incomplete information. But the reality was both less dramatic and more troubling than the initial assessment suggested. Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 wasn't experiencing an organized uprising or systematic escape attempt. It was experiencing the kind of institutional breakdown that occurs when systems designed to maintain control under normal conditions encounter stresses that exceed their capacity to function. The crisis wasn't the result of criminal planning or coordinated inmate action. It was the result of mechanical failures, procedural breakdowns, and the kind of cascade effects that occur when institutions operate beyond their design specifications for extended periods. It was a crisis that had been building for 18 months through small compromises and deferred maintenance, through budget pressures and procurement shortcuts that had created single points of failure throughout every system that the facility depended on for safe operation. The external response teams would ultimately spend 4 hours restoring order to Centro de Reinserción Social número 2, but the disorder they were addressing wasn't the kind that can be prevented through better tactics or enhanced equipment. It was the kind of disorder that emerges inevitably from institutions that are asked to function beyond their capacity with systems that are designed to fail under pressure. The Army's 30th Infantry Battalion arrived at 3:15 p.m. with personnel and equipment designed for military operations rather than correctional emergencies. The soldiers who secured the facility's perimeter were trained for combat against enemy forces, not for managing a complex institutional crisis involving civilian personnel and confined populations. The federal prison system's rapid response team, equipped with specialized training and equipment for correctional emergencies, didn't arrive until 4:42 p.m. due to weather delays that prevented their aircraft from landing at Villahermosa's airport. By the time federal expertise reached the scene, local responders had already implemented tactical solutions that addressed the immediate security threats while creating new problems that would complicate recovery efforts. The combination of state police, Army personnel, and prison guards operating with different training, different equipment, and different rules of engagement in a facility where communication systems were compromised created exactly the kind of complex coordination challenge that emergency response experts warn about, but that real emergencies rarely allow time to solve properly. The final gunshot was fired at 4:18 p.m. by an unknown person. Subsequent investigations were unable to determine whether the shot came from a guard or a state police officer, in response to a sound that was interpreted as hostile fire, but was actually a steam pipe rupturing under pressure from the facility's overloaded heating system. The shot struck no one but demonstrated that even 4 hours after the crisis began, personnel were still making split-second decisions based on incomplete information in an environment where mechanical failures continued to generate confusing sensory input. The all-clear signal was given at 6:23 p.m., 5½ hours after Rivera's discovery of the unlocked cell door. By that time, 7 people had been injured by gunfire or ricocheting debris. The facility's infrastructure had suffered damage that would require months to repair, and Centro de Reinserción Social número 2 had earned a place in the national conversation about prison security that no amount of subsequent reform could erase. But the most significant casualty of March 15th wasn't measured in injuries or infrastructure damage. It was the credibility of the assumption that security can be maintained through procedures and protocols when the physical systems that support those procedures are designed to fail under pressure. The crisis had revealed the difference between security that exists on organizational charts and security that functions when tested by reality. In the aftermath, when investigations and audits would examine every decision and procedure that had contributed to the breakdown, the fundamental question wouldn't be how the crisis could have been prevented through better training or enhanced procedures. The question would be how an institution could function safely when every system it depended on, from concrete foundations to radio communications to door locks, had been built to the lowest acceptable standard and maintained with resources that were insufficient for the environment where those systems had to operate. The answer to that question would reshape corrections policy throughout Mexico, but it would come too late for the careers, reputations, and physical safety that were sacrificed on March 15th to demonstrate the difference between building prisons and building institutions that can maintain public safety under pressure.